So now it's basically a good time to try to do a summary of what was discussed in the MARC session. I think it was an interesting mix of people going over the issues that we already started on DMARC mailing list, like what it means to implement DMARC for different parties, what the requirements are, and some special cases like what's the meaning of P equal none with no RUF option with no reporting. So what exactly does it mean? Is it syntactically valid, or but it's still not encouraged? There were quite a lot of comments about use of PCT option, which I think something we might want to discuss here. Seth, what are the other major?
So there were a few people from MOG who chimed in that P equals none without reporting presents ecosystem issues, and we've already had that discussion on list, and there was already consensus on that. But there's definitely clearly a need for a BCP there. There was a conversation around the percent tag and people who do find it valuable versus those who don't. And there was specifically for percent, there's also a wider conversation around percent equals 0 with P equals quarantine. I think that's actually a really meaningful conversation to have here at the IETF. And I think, Autumn, I believe you're on the phone, and I might ask you to provide more depth to that use case in particular. And then there were some additional questions of we actually get this at MOG from government organizations where there's an ask for a way to ask DMARC for both SPF and DKIM. And so that there's a meaningful conversation there because it comes up again. And I think that, again, to have that conversation with the IETF and to show consensus around that is meaningful, even though I think the answer is well known. I don't think that conversation's happened at the IETF. I think those are the very top line points, and there will be more that we'll summarize over time. And I think there's a comment in the chat here from the American Red Cross. I think it's Dave Crocker with the wrong display name. But it's an ask for the chairs to describe the scope of work of the DMARC-based project and how ARC slots in. So actually, Alexi, do you want to provide that overview?
Yeah, so roughly, the original DMARC spec was not published under IETF consensus rules, so it hasn't really gotten enough buy-in from IETF community. So this round, hopefully, we're doing it as a proper working group item, and want to make sure that the spec is clear, that if there are any unused features, that they are likely to be removed, or at least if there are features that people want removed, they need their presence should be justified in the spec. Also, we have a list of open issues on tools.ietf.org. I pasted the link for this, which we started collecting from 2015, and Seth added quite a bit more this year. So the idea is to go over known issues and try to reach rough consensus for change or no change. A lot of discussion going to be about what it means to implement a specific feature, so yeah, basically the idea is that we'll ask for about 3 issues at any given time, so that not to overload the mailing list, and we'll try to get closure and revise the document accordingly. The other thing is DMARC working group charter requires us to address indirect mail flows, for which we published ARC document as experimental RFC. So we are looking to get more experience with this, and hopefully if we get feedback that it's useful and get it quickly enough, then it will be folded into DMARC document itself to address this use case, because this is one of the major objections about instabilities that DMARC introduced into mail ecosystem.
And then my only other question is a follow-up. Murray, as the area director, what is your criteria to push forward a standards track DMARC document? Is there anything else you're looking for?
I mean, I don't have a checklist in mind. I think that it just needs to be able generally to pass standards track muster. So it's got to be a positive improvement. It needs to take into account the pain that DMARC as an informational document caused when it was rolled out sort of abruptly several years ago. I think the things that it probably needs to handle are fairly obvious to people in the community. So like I don't have specific I don't have a specific checklist in mind. I just I think that people are going to be looking at this very carefully for all the obvious reasons, and we just need to make sure that when we send it to the IASG or even to IETF last call, that we have done our due diligence about what those topics are going to be, and that we have a good answer for everything.
Yeah, let me jump in. This is Barry Liba. I was going to mention what Murray said. It has to deal with the issues of mailing list breakage that everybody is seeing. Everybody's well aware of that, and you're going to get a lot of pushback from IETF last call, I think, and from the IASG if the standard version of the document doesn't deal with it in some reasonable way.
So there's actually a question there that I think has to go to the list, not the interim. But is ARC something we actually need to fold into DMARC as like a third auth option?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't fold the document in, but you may need a normative reference and some discussion about how it can fit. It would also help if ARC is moved to proposed standard at the same time.
Yeah, I don't think that. You might convince me otherwise, but I don't think it makes sense to make ARC a formal part of DMARC. I think making it another layer or a piece of the authentication layer below it, that strikes me as more palatable, because it should be a sort of a plug and play type of mechanism. But we'll see as it evolves.
That's why I said a normative reference. I certainly would not merge it in.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you.
So then let's move on and actually speak about some of the operational issues that are coming over from MOG that haven't been well discussed at the IETF before. I think we have 3 people who've raised their hand to speak about the use case of P equals quarantine % equals 0. So I think there's Jesse Thompson, Autumn Tirsalvia, and M. Vendivis. And so the ask here is, if you want to actually speak, if you can just put +Q in the chat, and then we'll manage the queue just so it remains orderly. We don't have people muting and unmuting themselves and causing chaos. So if you're ready to speak, just throw +Q in the chat and we will call your name out. So great. Vendivis.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Michiel from Mimecast. So about the PS Quarantine PCT0 use case, the situation is that some email receivers adjust the message when forwarding it based on the DMARC policy. So let's say if the policy is PS none, they don't do anything with the headers. However, if the policy is PS quarantine, they could change the headers to make sure the message is still DMARC compliant. However, if you are a receiver or if you are a sender of a message, you want to make sure that you don't have any side effects when you go to a quarantine policy. And this is why the PCT0 use case is there. So if you go to the PS quarantine and PCT0, at least you know that there are no mails blocked yet because you have the PCT0, but you do know that the authentication of the messages also doesn't change if you go to another percentage tag. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is basically there are certain receivers when you move from a policy of none to a policy of quarantine, regardless of percentage, it impacts mail flow. And so %=0 lets you get reporting on the new mail flow without actually having any operational change on the sender end. Is that correct?
Yes. So for instance, for Google, they are one of the senders which do this, or they as soon as they see a message and it's forwarded, they change the sender of the message. So basically that message would actually disappear from the DMARC reporting of the initial sender.
Got it.
And change the point or the data you get in your DMARC reports, and that can change the opinion you may have on certain mail flows while implementing DMARC.
But if they change the from, then you don't actually get the report back from that change. So doesn't P equals quarantine %=0 hide the problem?
So in this case,
yeah,
it's let's say it's the forwarding is it is valid. Let's say so. It's not. It doesn't make the message itself invalid, but the initial message was valid, and they forwarded. Normally, that would break the DMARC setup for that message, but by changing the sender, they preserved the validity of the message.
Okay, thank you. We've got a few people lining up in queue. So, Autumn?
Hi. So to add on to that, this is a very common situation where there are participants in various mailing lists on a given domain. They send their emails out to the mailing list using their original from address. And then, of course, the list will change things. It'll fail SPF because the list server is not a part of the domain's SPF entry. And it will also fail DKIM because mailing lists make meaningful changes to DKIM. They'll change things like the message body by adding an unsubscribe link, which of course then changes the body hash and breaks DKIM. So by doing the header munging, that removes the concern that the message would then fail DMARC for the domain that is owned by the organization considering a more restrictive policy. But the challenge is that there are some mailing list providers that automatically munge headers for quarantine or reject policies, and others that require a manual intervention. So one example of this is groups.io is a mailing list service provider. They'll automatically change the headers when they see a quarantine or reject policy. Similarly, listserv by Elsoft of the sufficiently advanced version will also do this automatically. On the other hand, the popular mailing list service software Mailman has an option to do this, but it's something that an individual list admin must positively make a change for. And so when an organization is virtually done authenticating most of their traffic and they see some list server traffic, they have no idea if that will still be an issue for them after a quarantine or reject policy, or if the system in question will automatically rewrite those headers. And particularly for large organizations, they often have people participating in many mailing lists where it's not always obvious up front if that system will rewrite headers automatically or not. And so using the percentage equals 0 quarantine policy is one way that we will be able to see what headers will be rewritten, because as soon as we make that change, the systems that rewrite the headers disappear from the reporting data. And the systems that don't automatically make the change still show as fails. And so that can allow an organization to then go pursue header munging through intentional list admin changes for what traffic remains.
Thank you, Autumn. I have a question for you there then. Do you consider this and sort of an issue in the ecosystem with how mailing lists handle DMARC? Do you consider this a bug with DMARC? Do you consider the ability to do P equals quarantine percent equals 0 like a bug that you're taking advantage of, a feature that you're taking advantage of? Like how would you summarize this? Like if everything worked properly, is this needed? Or is this just because of friction in the ecosystem with how DMARC is handled?
I would say definitely the latter. It is because of friction in inconsistent mailing list practices, where some systems automatically make that change, other systems do not. And ideally, I would love to see every system automatically make that change, so that systems that are domains that are about to do a restrictive policy will not have mailing lists as an issue. This comes up a whole lot, and I know my esteemed colleagues will also speak to this, but I see this a lot for higher ed. I also see it a lot for government, because government researchers, higher ed researchers participate in mailing lists at a very high degree. And because of that, this has been a barrier to DMARC adoption. So I would say using percent equals 0 is a little bit of a hack, but at the same time, mailing lists were not adequately provided for, I think, in the spec originally. And so this is one way that we can get that vital information in an otherwise uncertain world.
Got it. And at the risk of saying an insane thing, if percent were removed, but some other way of communicating, hey, treat this like you would a mail stream under a policy, would that also meet the same need?
Yes. And in fact, it might do so better. There are a couple of small receivers that have a bug in their DMARC system such that they can never quarantine or reject any less than 2%. And so whenever I recommend a domain makes this change, we recognize that there will always be some number of messages that are actually quarantined, even when we have a percent equals 0. Similarly, there are a couple of systems that ignore the percentage flag entirely. So I only recommend domains do this when all other avenues have been exhausted. If there was another means of communicating header munging, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Autumn. That was very informative, at least for me. I hope for others too. Jesse.
Yeah, I think Autumn covered it really well, and I don't have too much to add other than the bug in that some receivers misinterpreting percent or treating it as 100. It kind of gets us closer to a destination-based alternative to percent itself by accident. So that might need to be addressed. The other thing that maybe is worth calling out is it would be great if we could get to all mailing lists to munge by default. And at the same token, it'd be great if there was a way for receiving systems to reconstruct what the original sender was in some standard way. Maybe ARC could solve that, but the problem I see with ARC is that the ARC, the mailing list doesn't know if the recipient system will support ARC and trust them from a reputation standpoint. So they have to munge. And I worry that we'll have to have mailing list munging essentially forever until we have a complete ARC adoption.
I think lots of people share that concern. Thank you, Jesse. And I'm going to ask you to talk again in a minute, potentially about stripped down failure reports. But before that, Scott, you raised your hand.
Seth, this is Scott. Did you just call on me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, one of the challenges here is all this from munging is not standardized. And so a standards organization seems to me to be kind of an odd place to complain about people doing unstandardized things wrong. And I get why people do it and why they want it, but from the way email works perspective, it's really a gross hack, and I don't think it's ever going to be anything other than something people do to get around problems. And so I don't think there's a lot of value in trying to figure out how to do it right, because I don't think there is a right, and I think it's pretty unlikely the IETF would accept it formally.
Alexi, Tim, Murray, Barry, anyone have a comment on that? Okay. Hearing no one.
Just a quick comment in general that I sort of hear what you're saying, Scott, but I think if we can get rough consensus in DMARC working group that something needs to be done on this, and we can get rough consensus on specific text, then things can change. Whether they would, obviously I have no way of knowing at this point. So
can certainly try.
Yeah, I think maybe we should try to. We should definitely have an open issue for this. Maybe we should try and see if we can resolve it, or whether it will resolve and no change required. We'll see.
So then, Scott, my ask for you is if you can create the issue and track, please.
Sorry, say again.
If you can create the issue and track, please.
I'm not sure what I would write, because we would, from my perspective, continue to say nothing about the thing we say nothing about, so there's no action.
Yeah, what are you asking him to log as an issue and track? I don't understand it either.
Just the conversation about Henderbuck, if there's something to do here or not. We think we know the answer, but the chairs can take that off to the side and figure out what we want to do.
Okay. So you seem to know.
I think that's better. I think that's better to do out of from the notes here. We can figure out if there's an action.
And then Jan Pierre, you're up next.
Yes, thanks. Just as a quick add-on to what Jesse said, basically, I was wondering if we could put something in the spec that says that senders should take care not to send out messages that violate DMARC in any way. But that should probably obviously be a should in the case of P is not P equals none. But it might be even stronger that if P equals quarantine or reject, that you must not send out messages that break it or something, and that would then apply to mailing lists. But it's just a suggestion of framing stuff.
So how would we get spammers and abusers to observe such a restriction?
Right. This is obviously not meant for spammers, because they would obviously not play by the rules. But it would be something you could show to like mailing list operators or people who are trying to do the right thing. But so it's more of a general framework where you can put all kinds of behavior. For example, there are sometimes web forms where you can put in your email address, and they tend to mail in the background with the from address set to whatever you put in that field. That is simply bad practice. But you could point people at this same spec, which so if you phrase it in the terms of mailing lists, then it's maybe a bit too specific. And if you just say, well, as I said, it's just a suggestion that I thought of. So.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile to bring to the list. I think, if you squint and look forward, and the DMARC's widely deployed, then people who do those things, that it'll never hit an inbox because they can't authenticate as the domain they're trying to send from. So the problem does actually solve itself with wide adoption of DMARC.
Well, or the opposite. If the rule is I'm not supposed to send out an email that would not fail DMARC, then that would mean I never send mail to an email list, which means I'm deleting my DMARC record.
Yeah, so
that problem.
Right. Yeah, but Scott, you are not the one sending the mail that goes wrong. That's the mailing list when it sends it on. So that I'm not saying nobody.
Forcing mailing lists to manipulate headers is an extremely touchy subject. And if that's what you're proposing, then I don't think that's going to go very far.
Yeah, I think there's a rabbit hole here that we're not going to get out of on the interim. So if Jan, if you think this is something you want to talk about, let's take it to the list. Let's see where it goes. But I think you're hearing which direction it will go. So the next thing I want to talk about, I think that was the cue, is that there was also conversation at MOG about forensic reports, and if there are ways, so instead of getting the entire contents of the message, you get more redacted messages or stripped down failure reports, the sense of you get just the auth results and to and from, or domains and URLs. I want to know if there's anyone who came over from MOG wants to talk about their point of view and what they might want here. And Autumn, you're up. Quick draw.
All right. Well, ultimately, I'm a anything that additional forensic reports, even if it's down. So I would prefer ideally full forensic reports because that information is very helpful. But I know there are a lot of systems that are concerned about privacy law violations or other issues. They might choose to not do forensic reports if they have to include a full set of headers that are expected. So stripped down data is better than no data. A lot of times I work with large organizations that have otherwise no idea what is being sent on their domain. So if you think of a large international business or a university, there are many distinct users that are not at all connected to the internal team that might be working on a DMARC project. And trying to figure that out is quite challenging. Even we'll often find multiple instances using the same service provider. So I can think of one government domain that had almost 30 separate MailChimp accounts. And the best way that we could find to get that information, in some instances, I have the ability to work with the email service provider, but in other instances, we're kind of stuck. So whenever we have forensic reporting, getting a from address is extraordinarily helpful. Even a subject line is additionally helpful. Links in the message are helpful, but even just a from address and label itself is a massive improvement above and beyond what we get from aggregate reporting. So if allowing a stripped down version of forensic reporting will in turn allow more organizations to send forensic reporting, I'm in favor of it.
I'm puzzled because the senders have always had the option to strip.
Kurt, there's a queue, and there are quite a few who want to speak.
Just to speak to that, yes, I suppose many of them have had that option, but I don't know that it's been encouraged, and that isn't what I tend to see in the data. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Autumn. Jesse.
Yeah, just because you called on me, I think Autumn did a good well explaining it yet again. Yeah, even within our own institution, we don't know who is using our domain. We know that they're sometimes using internal systems, but we don't. Those aren't central systems; they're distributed. They're using random ESPs, and the ESP generally just checks to see if they can receive mail at an address to verify if they can use the domain of some sort. And then we have a hard time even getting information from the ESPs as to which of their customers are using our domain, because that's private information to them. But generally, they've been helpful if we reach out, but it's just kind of cumbersome to go through that. I know that some of the DMARC vendors will use the SPF macro approach to try to get sense of which envelope from addresses are being used. That seems a little bit of a kludge and a privacy issue to me, but it is a little clever. So that's pretty much my perspective. It would be great if we could see the address or subject, like Autumn says, so that we can track down who they are and let them know to use a subdomain or something like that.
Thank you, Jesse. Dave. Crocker. Dave, if you're talking, you're muted. Crocker is speechless. Kurt, you're up.
So, Autumn, are you asking that in the spec we be more blatant about forensic reports can be whatever the heck you feel like you are comfortable sending, and then provide some sort of a ranked list of these are the things that are most useful to least useful if you're going to try to strip down your forensics?
Yes.
Okay.
Since I'm on one sec, there is one other point that I'd mention, and that's on the abuse fighting side of this. Sometimes these samples get forwarded to takedown vendors or law enforcement. And so that's another use case for this as well. It's not just companies wanting to do DMARC who don't know what they're sending. It's also the abuse fighting side too.
Thank you, Autumn. Dave, let's see if you fixed it.
So does this work now?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Good. Sorry about that. And sorry for not getting in the queue when I meant to be. I didn't figure out the mechanism. This is back to the header munging, not to give an answer, but to point out that I think there needs to be some clarity about what problem there is. It's easy to go to the symptom of header munging and focus on that, but stepping back and trying to make sure we understand what is the nature of the issue being dealt with, where header munging is a symptom that causes problems. I tried to get a little discussion of that going, which led to the suggestion for an author field. I'm not lobbying for that per se, but rather for being clear about what's the need, and then figure out how to solve it.
Thank you, Dave. I think the need to be very specific there is absolutely correct. There's a cue from Hanu Aronson.
Hello, coming back to the header munging question. So one of the topics identified in the MOVG session was that there are multiple MOVG stakeholders who have problems with DMARC and forwarding emails to external addresses. And I think that's kind of the bigger picture. So we have ISPs who forward email from domains they host to some other place. We have alumni websites and personal address websites, and we have mailbox providers who are also providing forwarding to their users. So I think it's a big question, how do you solve this indirect email flow use case in some meaningful way and avoid that kind of workarounds and hacks?
Thank you. Okay. I think the next thing was, sorry, there's
another queue request from Tonu.
Yes, sorry, I pulled up notes and missed it. Tonu, go ahead.
Yeah, I was also, I wanted to say about the issue of emails being forwarded and content being adjusted a little bit. Ultimately, if my understanding is correct, DMARC is about to sender's authenticity more than the integrity of the content. If you look at what DKIM, what elements are mandatory and what are optional, if you scale down on the elements to be included in hash calculation and you allow for the body to be modified, things will always pass through, but you ensure that the sender's authenticity is guaranteed.
Thank you. Steve Jones, you left a note in the chat, but do you want to talk to it?
Sure, if necessary. Wanted to show support for the idea of the reduced forensic reports or failure reports. I forget which term was last in common practice. If the idea hadn't already been floated, basically that while we saw several different degrees of redaction in practice when there were still multiple senders, a number of senders of those reports, perhaps it would be useful for those who reject it when they don't understand the scope of what's potentially involved, if they could see some examples of those redacted reports. I don't know if this rises to the level of something normative in DMARC BIS or something like an ARF spec, but in some sense, this might potentially address the availability of that information by increasing the potential pool, helping them get past their objections.
Thank you, Steve. Alex Brotman, if you're available, you made a comment about SPF. Do you want to make it publicly here?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
We can.
Yeah, it was just more of a comment, and I know Todd asked for some examples, but I extended my comment a little bit more after the fact. It would be nice if DMARC BIS could make some, I don't know if requirement's the right word, but some restrictions of some sort about SPF that involves weak all statements. So if they use like a plus all, can DMARC, as we go through DMARC BIS, can we make it so that a plus all invalidates it or something like that, or won't work on P equals reject or something like that? I don't know if something like that is the case, but and then I extended it to also potentially say like, well, maybe we end up with something like a matrix where question mark all only works with quarantine and none and something like that, and then plus all doesn't work with anything or something like that. But it's just it was just a thought, just because we have seen in the past folks who are something like P equals quarantine, but they're plus all, which is kind of not really ideal.
And Alex, one clarifying question before I jump to the queue. It sounds like it, but are you seeing operational issues? Like, are this actually causing like spam and abuse problems at Comcast?
I mean, it has caused spam issues. We've had to have some senders correct it. It doesn't necessarily really cause operational issues, although I bet on the other side, if they're getting DMARC reports, they're probably getting a lot more than they anticipated, much larger reports. But I can't really comment on that because we're not seeing it ourselves. But it's just, something like that is potentially a way that we can help strengthen SPF if folks want the advantages of DMARC to help protect their domain. I don't know if we really want to try to intermingle the two, but.
So I think
more so intermingled. I'm sorry.
Discussing this, I think, is actually in the DMARC working group's charter, but I think it's out of the scope of DMARC BIS. But I want to know what the consensus of the group is, what the other chairs think. But to that, Kurt, and yeah. Go ahead.
I'm going to agree that discussing it is probably fair as long as we don't rat hole on it. I don't see how making it more complicated to determine the truth table of what constitutes a pass is going to help anybody in a proper implementation, though. I don't see that this is beneficial. There's lots of ways to sneak around this. And if we're going to say that there's some fuzzy line where, oh, that's too loose, it's going to be a never ending problem. So I don't think that it is viable, and I would not be in favor of it.
And bad auth is separate than what does it mean to do the auth properly?
Well, what is it? Yeah, how do you evaluate it properly? Yeah.
Okay, Murray.
So 2 points. One, with my AD hat on, I do not believe that you are forbidden by the charter from talking about this or proposing an extension in the DIS or a change in the BIS document to actually take this into account. As an implementer, though, I'll point out that your interface between SPF and DKIM and ARC and DMARC is the authentication results field, which does not give you a way to say the SPF policy in effect for this was plus all. So you don't actually have that information. You would have to create that channel. At least that's the most common interface between the two. So if you're going to create this add this as a criterion, you have to think about how you're going to get that information.
Thank you, Murray. Jim Fenton had a question on a slightly different topic. So before we switch topics, I also believe on the list, this came up briefly, and Scott Kitterman had a point of view. So I wanted to give Scott a chance to jump in if he wanted. Otherwise, we'll go to Jim and change the topic.
I think we can do it on the list later.
Great.
Thanks, Scott. Not a lot of time and other things to talk about.
Great. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Hope you can hear me. One of the things that came up on the list recently that I think was kind of buried in another discussion was the question of whether whether users actually can see, or if they can see, do they act on the domain the domain in the email address of the from field. And I'm not sure that was resolved. And there were definitely some people that were arguing that either users can't see the address or that they're not going to pay any attention if they do see it. So the reputation argument doesn't really quite hold. I think it's important to this working group that there be a consensus on that question. So I'm asking the chairs to perhaps create it as an issue or something of that sort. Over.
Sure. I think that's an absolutely fair request. Let's sidebar figure out what the right issue should be in the tracker, but
chairs might be able to delegate back.
Jim, it seems like you're being asked to create the issue in the tracker.
I will do that. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so we've just got 5 minutes left. Alexi, Tim, is there any housekeeping we need to do, Murray, or are we good to just see if there are any other questions?
No, we should be good. Sorry, I had a lot of background noise earlier, so I couldn't actually jump in on stuff. So, but on the SPF plus all, that may be better in a BCP document than in the DMARC biz stuff. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, I just think it's a reasonable topic for the working group generally. Yep. How you want to deal with it, it's up to you right now.
Yep.
Excellent. So then I don't see anyone else in the queue. Anyone have a final thought or final thing they want to raise or thought was brought up at MOG that they want to bring up right now? Okay. Since I'm not seeing any additional, oh, there's Kurt. Go ahead.
It wasn't brought up at MOG, but looking at the time and how we only have 6 minutes left, or 3.5 or something, I'd like to find out from the chairs what they're intending for the agenda in the July IETF 108 meeting. so that people can figure out whether to pony up the $300 to join the discussion in July.
That's a good question, actually, because I think some of that was going to be driven by what was going on during the mailing list. But I almost wonder if we scheduled like another interim, those actually have a no cost item. So there may be some relevance in actually skipping the 108 and then having an interim like in August, which would, you know, which wouldn't be.
I would vote for that.
Yeah, I actually would vote for that too. So, but we can discuss that among the chairs and see how they feel about that. Because that actually is like 2 months from now, and that gives us some time on the list to sort of hash out some stuff. So Seth and Lexi and I can work that over. But
yeah, we were also very curious how this went and if we were able to transfer anything from MOG to this conversation. So we have some notes to compare.
Yep.
That said, Jan-Pierre, you've got 2 minutes. Go for it.
Okay, just a quick one now. I wonder if anybody's also tracking the bounces that come back from reports. I've only recently started doing that, and in the beginning I just threw everything away, but the amount of reports that just bounce is staggering. And it's like 50% of the domains only accept reports, roughly. I haven't got exact stats. Anybody interested in this, or am I just completely barking up the wrong tree?
This is Jesse. I think that may be a symptom of the fact that reports are most useful while a domain is rolling out DMARC, and then after they're done, they largely don't look at them. So they maybe just delete the mailbox or something.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I figured. So maybe what I currently do is just gradually send less and less mail, but less and less reports, but otherwise do nothing with it. So, okay, well.
And Jan, I would actually take that back to the MOG technical list and see if other people are seeing that operationally, because if there is a signal there, that's actually useful to bring back to the IETF.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably a good thing. I'll send a message to the DMARC list. I'm subscribed. I think I just haven't been paying lots of attention, but thanks for pointing it out.
Okay, everyone, we're right at the end. Thank you all very much for participating. And again, if you're here from MOG, you should join the IETF DMARC list. We'd really appreciate your participation. Thank you. Any final words from Tim, Alexi, Murray, Barry?
just thanks for attending all and for the good conversation.
Nothing to add from me.
Yeah, thank you all. I think this was quite productive, so we'll hopefully continue collaboration.
Yes. Thanks all.